What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Welcome to a complete history of Lee Sin. He's definitely one of the more unique and iconic champions in League of Legends, and with his incredible popularity throughout the years, I thought he'd be a great champion to kick off the start of a new series, where I take a look back and show you the full impact each champion has had on League of Legends over the years. If you guys enjoy this kind of series, don't forget to click the like button so I know it's worth it to make more, but if you'd prefer to see me spend time on other content instead, please click the dislike button so I know as well. Anyways, let's get started. Our journey begins at the very early stages of League of Legends, where a character known as the Blind Monk was developed as a part of the first original 6 champions of the game, alongside Singed, Sion, Annie, Sivir, and Twisted Fate, the 5 of which who were all added into the game during the alpha stage. Despite having a complete model, the Blind Monk, however, was not added into the game during the alpha stage and was eventually cancelled, making him one of, if not the actual first champion to ever get cancelled in League of Legends. He was eventually later brought back due to community popularity and support. And so CoriNak, the designer behind champions such as LeBlanc, Corki, and Yorick, began to work on bringing Lee Sin to life. A few months later, on March 21st in 2011, Lee Sin the Blind Monk was officially announced. 7 days later, his champion Spotlight was released, but it was a bit unique. Let's take a look.
Lee Sin is a ranged melee, tanky DPS, assassin, mage, tank, support, jungler. He excels at everything. Lee Sin's hidden passive is Blindness. Your entire screen is blurry while playing him at all times. I start the game at level 18, because I'm Lee Sin, the Blind Monk. 15 minutes into the game, Baron Nashor spawns. Simply by walking towards it, the Baron kills himself for me, because I'm Lee Sin, the Blind Monk. Immediately afterwards, I get ganked by not only the enemy champions, but one of my own teammates has actually defected, making it a 1v6. Unfortunately, he won't be coming out immediately with the upcoming patch, as we might need to buff him a little bit. However, we're confident we can get him ready for release on April 1st, 2011.
His actual champion Spotlight was released 3 days later, and the next day, on April 1st, in patch 1.0.0.114, Lee Sin was released and became available to play as the 73rd champion to enter the League of Legends, becoming the only champion to this day to ever be cancelled, but then released under their original name. Lee Sin was intended to be somewhat of an assassin solo laner, but players found success with him as a high-pressure early-game jungler, with a kit that still let him find some use in teamfights. Also at the time, the jungle meta played a supportive style, so by being strong in the early game, Lee Sin was able to bully out other champions and find that a reasonable amount of matchups were in his favor in the hands of a skilled player. His overloaded kit proved to be quite complex, and so he was heavily praised as a champion who rewarded skill and let great players make great plays. On release, he was underpowered for a short while until 5 days later, on April 6th, he received a massive buff in the hotfix that took place, and we saw the first time ever that Lee Sin was regarded as overpowered. He was immediately nerfed in the next patch 6 days later, and the community realized that Lee Sin was going to be one of those champions that was an uphill climb to balance, as his kit was quite frankly overloaded. Shortly after, a bug popped up that allowed you to use Lee Sin's Resonating Strike an infinite distance across the map to follow things like teleports and recalls, leading to some fairly hilarious moments, and was eventually patched out. Also at the time, there was a problem with his safeguard that allowed him to jump to objects that were invisible to the enemy team, mainly wards of course, and so in an attempt to address that, 2 patches later on patch 120, Lee Sin's safeguard could no longer target wards. This was generally regarded as a change that ruined the fluidity and dynamic of his kit, and after community uproar, the change was reverted immediately in the next patch, patch 121, but caused wards that Lee Sin jumped to be revealed, rather than having it look like he was jumping to an invisible target. Around this time in September 2011, we saw the first case of Lee Sin in official documented competitive play. He was first ever picked by Dan Din on Team USA in the Sound Blaster Nations Championship, although it's worth noting that he was banned but not picked in multiple matches before of Poland vs France and Spain vs Germany. He would go on to receive a few more minor changes and nerfs to numbers here and there as he continued to succeed in the jungle meta. Throughout all of Season 2, he was a reasonably competitive pick, and became popular as many pro players developed themselves into Lee Sin experts. Later on patch 154, which was the start of Preseason 3, Lee Sin received a reasonably sized nerf, which was to his slow and range on his Tempest, and a removal of the armor bonus from Iron Will in return for increased spell vamp and lifesteal. But at this time, the jungle also received a massive change and generally became much easier to farm. This patch sparked the true rise of Lee Sin into dominance, as he became one of the best junglers for an incredibly long time because of this change. With an easier jungle to farm up early game, the jungle began to favor early game pressure junglers, and the community coined what became known as the Lee Sin factor, as he became the champion that defined the early pressure-based jungle meta. The Lee Sin factor was essentially this threshold that had to be considered when theory crafting any jungle pick, because if their early game wasn't strong enough, they would get completely dumpstered by a Lee Sin invading, meaning that that champion was unfortunately unviable in the jungle meta, since they were unable to survive the early game. This Lee Sin factor was so relevant because although he would go on to be one of the best junglers for the entirety of Season 3, he was never actually the best jungler, so he had a very high pick rate, but a somewhat low ban rate, and didn't actually receive a single nerf for the entire season, with the exception of the minor change on patch 3.15 that caused his safeguard to no longer shield minions. In May of 2013, the first All-Star tournament took place in Shanghai, and the world got to see Insec, a Korean jungler playing for KT Rolster B, showcase his moves on Lee Sin on the global stage for the first time ever. With his iconic move of jumping in on a target with Resonating Strike, ward jumping behind them, and then ulting them back into the rest of his team, the Korean showcased the play that became known as the Insec to the entire League of Legends community. Season 3 continued, and eventually as we reached Season 4, Lee Sin remained relevant as a top tier pick. On patch 4.5 he received a minor nerf, but despite that he remained dominant, and the jungle trifecta of Evelynn, Elise, and Lee Sin dominated the competitive jungle meta as the only popular junglers at the time of Season 4 where tank junglers suffered from poor itemization, and of course, the Lee Sin factor. So for 2 whole seasons, Lee Sin defined the jungle meta, and in patch 4.13 he received a massive nerf that saw the removal of the attack speed debuff on his cripple, and the duration of the shield on his safeguard being cut in half, with his health regen receiving a small increase. This was the patch that marked the decline of the Season 4 jungle trifecta, as other junglers finally began to rise up to be on par or above the existing favorites. On patch 4.18, he received a new splash art among a few other champions, and on patch 4.20, he once again received a small nerf. Patch 4.20 marked the most recent nerf to Lee Sin, and after the Season 5 jungle changes to make the camps much more difficult, similar to how it was back in Season 2, we saw a significant decline in his play. For the first time since Season 2, Lee Sin no longer defined the jungle meta, as he would go on throughout all of Season 5 to be a relatively middle-of-the-pack jungler, especially after Cinderhulk was introduced and we saw a tank meta develop. He still saw some competitive play, but suffered a lot as his win rate reached all-time lows of 44% in solo queue. He remained around 44 to 46% win rate for the entirety of Season 5, and on patch 5.16 he received his first meaningful buff since 2011. This buff made his passive a bit more top-heavy to restore energy faster in fights, and caused his ultimate to deal extra damage to targets hit by the player that was kicked. This was the most recent change that happened to Lee Sin, but who knows what will happen to him in the future. One thing we know for sure is that the Blind Monk has been one of the most impactful and most loved champions throughout League of Legends history. And that's just about it. Here's some of my favorite comments from a previous video where I asked, should Creeplock exist in League of Legends? For a chance to be featured in a future video, leave a comment about what champion you think I should make a complete history for next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.